Here I am, 3.5 hours into today's running, in a world of pain and already regretting what I got myself into. But there was no going back. Have you ever wondered what motivates people to push themselves to the limit of human endurance and actually run an ultramarathon? Well, I have. But to be honest, until now, I hadn't given it much thought. I only started running earlier this year, but this sport has already given me so much, and I wanted more of it. So I made a decision I may come to regret, and registered for 2 of the UK's most gruelling ultramarathons in 2024. The only issue is, I have no idea what I'm doing. The furthest I've ever ran in one go was 60 miles, and that was less than 4 weeks ago. But I've now committed to raise money for the 2 teenage cancer charities that supported my sister through her battle with lymphoma 10 years ago. And later this very month, I'm going to run non-stop from sunrise until sunset. I set out on a cold winter's day with the plan to train myself for the challenges that lay ahead. I knew I was out of my depth. That was crystal clear early on. But what I didn't realise was that in training for an ultramarathon, I'd be forced to confront what my underlying motivations were to run. And in the process, I'd learned something profound about myself. So the 2 races I've signed up for are a 50-kilometre race and a 100-kilometre ultramarathon in June and July next year. I'll be raising money for the Teenage Cancer Trust and Young Lives vs Cancer. So to start raising this money, I've decided to run non-stop from sunrise to sunset on the winter solstice later this month. That's 7 hours and 49 minutes of running. Despite a weekly long run being a staple in my training for the last few months, 60 miles is as far as I've ever gone before. So with only a few weeks between now and the big date, last weekend I decided to do my first proper ultra training run. I'd aimed to run for 4 hours, but given that was close to double what I'd done before, I would split this into 2 2-hour runs over the day. So I woke up early on Sunday morning, fully carb loaded and mentally prepared to push myself to the limits. I looked out the window and yeah, the snow was a surprise. I tried to see the bright side. Ultramarathons were meant to be hard after all, right? I wrapped up warm, swapped my trusty everyday runners for my trail shoes and headed out for run number 1. So first of all, I've not always been a runner. I spent the first few years of my early adulthood whilst at medical school obsessed with lifting weights and didn't really understand why people would run for fun. But that all changed earlier this year. My wife and I moved to New Zealand in search of a better work-life balance, as I was burned out after my first few years of working as a doctor and found that my training and hobbies had inevitably taken a backseat. What I found in New Zealand was a stunning natural environment, and I rediscovered my love for the outdoors. We started running as a way to explore our new home, and also because we live literally on our local parkrun course. It didn't take long before we were hooked. I felt like I was starting to understand why people would run, but I couldn't yet quite put my finger on why I was enjoying it so much. So fast forward 6 months and we're sadly back in the East Midlands in the UK. And when I booked these ultramarathons, I think I was hoping to find a bit of what we'd left behind in New Zealand, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly that was yet. So despite the frigid temperatures, I was warming into this run and enjoying the first few easy miles whilst I could, trying not to think of what laid ahead. The little I do know about ultra running has come almost entirely from watching my favourite YouTuber Mark Lewis.
I make it up as I go along with no idea what I'm doing half the time.
So it was like the blind leading the blind out there. What I had gained from his videos, however, were threefold. Your nutrition and hydration needed to be on point. Small problems would become big problems quickly. And finally, running very long distances was going to be very hard. As I was only going a relatively short distance and was splitting my run into 2 separate chunks, I hoped today would be straightforward and would just be about getting easy time in heart rate zone 2, as the focus was on building cardiovascular endurance. This would turn out not to be as straightforward as expected. It didn't take long before my feet were soaked, and kind of heeding Mark Lewis's advice, I was acutely aware that this might be a problem the longer I left them. Knowing I only had 2 hours of running to get through this time, I pushed on and entered a snowy wonderland. I was starting to enjoy myself, and with all this time alone with my thoughts, I started to reflect on one of the reasons I think I'd started to love running.
Someone commented on one of my videos a couple of weeks back, saying that going out, plugging your headphones in, running long distances, there's nothing better for the mind and soul. And he's so right. I really believe there's something about being out in the elements, running, it just makes you feel so alive.
I made time for a quick toilet break, and as I looked down and admired how light and clear my urine stream was, I thought that even Mark Lewis himself would be proud of how diligently I was managing my fluid intake. I shook off both thoughts of Mark Lewis and the last drops of urine, and pushed on towards the end of the first 2 hours. I started to develop an ache in my right hip, a problem I've noticed occasionally towards the end of my last few long runs. My legs were becoming a bit heavy these last few miles, and I'd noticed I was having to run increasingly slower each mile to keep my heart rate within target. And before any of this had time to become a problem, I was back home. 1 hour 55 minutes of running, average pace of 6 minutes 38 per kilometre with an average heart rate of 148 beats per minute. Nice and easy. I got showered, ate several meals primarily consisting of carbs and foam rolled. This was the big advantage that splitting the run up gave me. And 3 hours later, I was ready to go again. this time with new dry socks and running shoes fresh off the radiator. And Lou was also joining me for company on this second run. So we got going and I surprisingly felt really fresh. That lasted all of 1 mile, and then the niggly pain in my right hip was back. And by 2 miles, I might as well not have bothered changing my socks because they were soaked again. When I said earlier, I don't know what I'm doing, I mean, I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm reluctant to start a formal training program as I still lift weights several times a week and likely wouldn't be able to cope with the running volume required of a proper ultramarathon program. I also realise that ultras are very individual, and really the best way to learn what works for you is just to build experience in running very long distances. My initial thoughts are that although physical preparation is important, probably the mental side of completing a 100-kilometre run is equally, if not more, crucial. But that's not to say I wouldn't appreciate some advice from any of you ultra runners out there watching. The comments are open. Please and thank you. Lil was acting as a bit of a pace setter at this point, and I stayed on her heels. As I settled back into a rhythm, I continued thinking about why I'd started off on this path. Raising money for the charities that helped my sister through the most difficult period of her life is without a doubt the reason I've started fundraising. But why I'd chosen to do that by running these ultramarathons was starting to become clear the more I thought about it. Through moving to New Zealand and finding running, I'd started to realise I was neglecting other aspects of my life that helped give it purpose. Running gave me an opportunity to have time to myself and time with my wife again, time in my own head to digest the day, and time to reflect on what I wanted and was important for me. It gave me an excuse to set goals and challenge myself, like training for an ultramarathon, and it gave me an opportunity to enjoy the process and the grind, not just the end result. But also as a 27-year-old, it helped me realise that I don't want to spend all my years in my theoretical physical prime with my head down and in complete tunnel vision, focusing exclusively on a career at the expense of all other important aspects of my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realised that this was what was motivating me. We pushed on and it became abundantly clear that I was going to have to slow down as my heart rate kept climbing, despite running slower than my normal pace on long runs. With over an hour of training left, I knew it would be unsustainable to continue running at these high heart rate zones. Also, this pain in my hip was really starting to ache and my legs were starting to stiffen significantly. Thankfully, Lil was far more willing than I usually am when we run together to slow the pace. As we passed the halfway point of this second run, it was blindingly obvious this wouldn't be the walk in the park I thought it might have been. I realised not only was I building my cardiovascular endurance, but more importantly on these really long runs, I was building my mental endurance and resilience, and riding out this discomfort was part of the training really. What I was doing that day wasn't particularly impressive from an endurance point of view compared to a lot of people, and I realised that what lay ahead on the horizon for me would be orders of magnitude more difficult than this, both in terms of distance and terrain. But I drew motivation and inspiration from the fact that I was pushing myself to the limit of my own endurance. It was exhilarating, at least from my point of view. Probably quite underwhelming from an onlooker's perspective, who are likely to be thinking, does that man need a Lil's selfless patience came to an end, and she left me so she could continue to run, rather than whatever I was doing at that point. But that was okay. I finished out the last few miles pretty slowly, half hobbling to avoid the pain in my hip, but with a wry smile on my face, quietly satisfied at the small milestone I passed today. So what has my training taught me so far? Well, through my time in New Zealand, and since coming back to the UK, it's taught me to prioritise my own journey. Yes, I've set some huge goals in wanting to run 2 ultramarathons, but the journey I've started to get me there is already filling a void I used to have in my life, back when I was too busy with my career to even think about the term work-life balance, let alone have one. I don't want to continue to set a goal in one part of my life and grind my way towards it at the expense of everything else, with the hope that when I reach that point, things will be better, or I'll be happy or satisfied. I've realised you spend the vast majority of your time on the journey to the end goal, rather than at the end point itself. So it's critical you enjoy the process, because that's ultimately what life is. So I'm not saying it's essential to train for an ultramarathon to reach that point. It's just for me, through starting this training and the way I came to running, I've been given a medium that has allowed me to reprioritise what's important, and this is now what's motivating me to run. I'm enjoying each opportunity to be out in the natural world, in spending time with my wife, in raising money for 2 charities that are important to my family, in having quiet time to be mindful and reflect, in having a creative outlet with this YouTube channel to document the journey, and especially in times like last weekend where I pushed myself to my limits and raised my own bar. And that was just a small taster of what's to come later this month, and then in summer next year, but I'd love you to come along on the journey, so make sure you subscribe. And finally, my fundraising links are down below if you want to donate, and I'll see you again next time.